PM2.5 concentration of 25 micrograms per cubic meter over a 24-hour period, that was considered safe. But now the WHO has lowered that to just 15 micrograms, saying that anything above that is considered unsafe. PM2.5, along with another pollutant known as PM10, they are those pollutants that do the most damage to our respiratory system, to our lungs, and therefore that is why measuring those is the most crucial. Now, these earlier norms that the WHO had in place, they were there since 2005. And what this essentially means is that a big chunk of our country now is considered polluted. And the question is, what can India do to tackle this growing problem? What these guidelines show is that air pollution has been far more damaging to our health than perhaps we had earlier known. Joining us to talk about this important policy issue this evening, Anumita Roy Chaudhary, Executive Director, Research and Advocacy with the Center for Science and Environment. Good to see you again after a long time, Anumita Roy Chaudhary. We have Mr. Bhargav Krishna, Fellow with the Center for Policy Research, who's done extensive work in this field, and Jyoti Pandey Lavakare, co-founder of Care for Air, joining us today at the Kautilya School of Public Policy as well. Anumita Roy Chaudhary, to you first. I'm in Delhi at the moment where we are already seeing the air quality gradually worsen. You can see it in the air, you can see it in the data now, and we're heading into winter. What do these guidelines mean for all of us, on a sort of practical day-to-day basis? Because they're not legally binding on India either. So what do they actually mean for you and me?
Nidhi, the message that we get from the new guidelines is actually quite scary. What WHO has done, that even before we could meet the benchmark for clean air, the earlier benchmark, they have raised the bar. And what they're essentially saying, the whole tightening that has happened of the standards, they have actually saying that it's based on the mounting health evidences globally, which is showing that air pollution can cause much harm at much lower levels than previously thought. And therefore, they have redefined the threshold of safe air. I mean, just keep these three numbers in mind, and you just actually explain that. So today, for annual average of PM2.5, WHO recommends 5 microgram per cubic meter. Our standards are 40. And during the pandemic 2020, Delhi's air, it was 98. Okay, and it can be much higher in other parts, in other years. Now, just look at the contrast and stark difference. And therefore, what it means is really very scary, where the thresholds have become so much tighter and stronger. But it has now huge implications, because it's just not the particulate matter, even for the gaseous pollutants like NOx and SO2. Even these are much tighter than what we have adopted in India. And at the same, but only 2, I think, pollutants, ozone and carbon monoxide, for which the standards have not really changed. Now, what this really means now that today India, as you know, is also in the process of setting up its own process of further revising its own standards. And now that we have the WHO guidelines in front of us, it means it has to kind of reflect. But of course, and we will discuss that why it is so tough for India and this region to meet those guidelines right away. But at least the intermediate step, and that's what the WHO is also saying, that the interim targets that we now need to adopt has to facilitate stepwise improvement in air quality for gradual improvement, so that we can actually hope to meet the WHO guidelines in the future. But this is directly linked with the disease burden. And even bigger question for us is, and what is challenging, that can we in India, given its very, we of course, given the, the momentum and the whole, and the way the pollution sources are increasing across the country, that coupled with our own meteorological and climatic conditions, with added challenge of our haze, the heat island effects, dust, our background levels, all of that make it hugely difficult and challenging to really bring it down. But I just want to add one point before I end now, is that even then in India, and especially after looking at the WHO guidelines, the natural curiosity is that we know that Indo-Gangetic plains can be very, very polluted, and we see these horrendous peaks. But there are also other parts of India, and that's why there is a natural curiosity. How low can air pollution get in India? High, we all understand, but how low does it get? Now, we had some glimpse of it during the pandemic, when we have seen that when we or nearly eliminated local pollution and regional influence, we have seen dramatic decline. But that was for the humanitarian crisis. But we need, the message there is that we need that kind of scale and speed of action to be able to meet that standards. But even then in India, there are parts of India, the southern part of India, there are different parts we have seen that the annual averages can actually be as low as 12, 17 microgram per cubic meter.
It's possible.
So that's why we really need to understand that as we go forward, does country like India, such a huge country, do we need to have more nuanced approach towards setting guidelines, that we do not pit the cleaner part of the southern India with the Indo-Gangetic plain, but also make the so-called other areas which have lower levels to also meet the next levels of WHO guideline. But one point that I really want to highlight here, that this is about the difference in air pollution levels across the country. But if you look at the global burden of disease estimates that have been calculated for different states of India, and Bhargav will tell you more about that. But that shows that irrespective of the levels, the health risk in terms of number of people dying per 100,000 population is nearly uniform across the country. It is not that the less people per 100,000 are dying in Mumbai or Chennai compared to Delhi or other parts in northern India.
Yes. Okay, there are actually a number of important points you've made there that I'd like to follow up on in just a moment. But Bhargav, Krishna, if you could weigh in on this. I think I saw a figure that, in fact, life expectancy in, let's say, the national capital now is about 6 years less than the national average at the because of air pollution. Is that correct? What is the data telling us just about the impact on our health?
Sure. Life expectancy figures are severely impacted, of course, but what we have now over the last decade and a half done in India is that we have a significant body of evidence that shows the impact on health across the life course, really, starting from the impacts on the fetus through in utero or pregnancy related exposures, through early childhood exposures and impacts on lung function, through exposures on adults and their impact on cardiovascular disease and diabetes and hypertension and several other illnesses, and of course premature mortality associated with high exposures in the short term. So over the last 10 years, we've generated a significant amount of data associated with all of these related exposures across different parts of the country, largely run by Indian institutions. And so the sort of canard that we used to have, that India doesn't really have the health data to justify action on air pollution, and that Indians may respond differently to higher or lower levels of air pollution than people living in Western Europe or in North America, is really something that doesn't hold true anymore here. And this brings us to what the WHO air quality guidelines have relevance for in terms of India's own sort of revision of its national ambient air quality guidelines. I mean, if you look at the standards that they've set for PM2.5 exposures for daily as well as annual exposures, our standards are anywhere between 4 and 8 times higher. And there's really no reason that should be the case. Indian lungs are really no different than lungs anywhere else in the planet. And the same goes for the rest of our bodies. And the sort of roadmap that these guidelines have set is essentially a pathway that looks at really deep decarbonization of the economy. We are looking at a message that's being sent by the health sector that if we want to achieve improved air quality that is requisite for sort of improved health across all populations that are prevalent across all parts of the world, we really need to phase out fossil fuel use extensively across our economies, both in developed and in developing countries. Without that, you're really not going to be able to reach a position where any country, let alone India, meets these standards.
Okay, well, I guess that has to be a sort of medium to long-term plan, and I'd like to come back to what we need to do now in just a bit. But Jyoti ji, just your thoughts when you looked at this WHO data, how much does it frighten you in terms of the impact this is having on all of us? Do you think people are still underestimating the impact of air pollution?
Absolutely. I think the awareness in this area is still very, very low. And so the first thing we have to understand, and I think even the WHO has said that during the revision of these guidelines, that actually there are no safe levels of air pollution. I mean, they have taken these, they've revised these after 16 years, but within the revision, there is a statement which comes through, which is that there are no safe levels of air pollution. And I think if we are trying to manage versus eliminate this problem, then that is more of a political issue. That is more, you're not really looking at air pollution as a health problem, especially in India. It's still seen as an environmental hazard, whereas I think the filter that we need to use whenever we talk of air pollution is clearly about the health harm that it causes. And I think in that sense, the government has to also, like, for example, when COVID happened, I think there was almost instant awareness. The government used everything that it had at its disposal, including every single phone call where you got that COVID message. And I think if there was even a slight, a similar sort of focus on trying to build awareness of this sort of a killer, which is actually a bigger killer than even COVID, that would be one thing. And then the second thing, I think we definitely need to align the national standards to the WHO standards, because, there is no, like Bhargav was saying, I don't think there is any justification. Human lungs and human organs are, same everywhere. We are all human beings. So how can you have different standards? And in that sense, I think when you have standards which are much more lax than WHO standards, what you're doing is you're, in a sense, making more of a sort of a political or policy statement rather than saying that, are we valuing our health or the health of our citizens enough? Is that really what we're doing? And if not, and the last thing I think I want to say is, because we know that this is a man-made anthropogenic problem, there are ways, we have all the tools in our hands to actually sort these issues. We know a large cause of it is fossil fuels. We know what the basic sources are. So I think we have the tools in our hands, and I think we've talked about it, and people, the experts like Anumita and Bhargav, etc., we all know really what the issues are. The thing is, who is going to bell the cat? Who is going to take those important policy decisions?
The question, though, then is, Anumita ji, that is there a political will, you think, or is it, as you kind of hinted, it may not be practical for India to make more stringent guidelines internally and match those standards of the WHO, simply because we still do have an economy that depends upon coal and fossil fuels, etc. So that change is not going to happen anytime soon, in which case, what do we do in the short term? Because it seems at the moment, our entire efforts at curbing air pollution are very ad hoc, odd even, or, let's water the roads, and then, these smog towers. I don't even know if they work. From what I've read, experts say that it doesn't even work. But, money has been spent to show that we are doing something, right? So what is the short-term answer?
I really don't think there is a short-term answer. And what we really need to do, and so solutions are all known today, but it's an interesting scenario at this moment. At one level, we are finding that our policies are changing very rapidly. You pick up any air pollution related policy or regulation that deal with, whichever source of pollution, you will find all the right principles and everything in it. But the big gap is between the policy principles and what we are doing on ground. And that's a huge gap. And the gap is also happening because of huge deficit in our infrastructure, in our systems, capacity of the system, processes not laid down, accountability systems have not been fully established, responsibility and accountability, both vertical and horizontal, they don't work. And that's why, despite having all the policies, we are not being able to see the change on ground. Second, it's also very clear that right now, our action is also very limited to local situation, to one city, within municipal boundary. But the WHO report, if you read it, it brings out so clearly that now you really need a regional approach to air pollution control. So under National Clean Air Program today in India, you're talking about 122 cities. Most of them are tiny little municipalities. But even if you try to do something within those municipalities, the larger influence of the larger region is so overwhelming, but there is no strategy to address pollution across Indo-Gangetic Plain. Every winter, and winter is on us right now, we scream and shout about the Delhi's pollution, but if you look at the map of India at that point of time, we are only a tiny speck in the whole buildup that happens across the region. So therefore, whatever we are doing is very small, cosmetic, very late. The other problem is, Nidhi, that we don't even understand when we want to build the political understanding of the solutions, we don't even understand the scale and speed of solution that is needed. Now, even in Delhi today, whatever you may say, compared to all other cities of India, at least this city has shut down all coal power plants, moved its public transport, commercial vehicles to natural gas, phasing out old vehicles, expanding natural gas in industry, all that is happening, right? Now, even after doing all that, we are saying Delhi still needs to reduce pollution by yet another 60%. But none of us can fathom that for that 60% reduction, what is the scale and speed of action that is needed? And what you rightly said, that scale of speed is needed today for massive, massive mobility transition so that we can really scale up public transport, walking, cycling options, massive energy transition. Today, 75% of energy system is fossil fuel, and the power generation is coal-based. Now, obviously, you cannot achieve pollution reduction with that kind of energy mix. And the other one is a circular economy. If all the waste gets dumped and burned, okay, and you don't have municipal systems to handle your waste, then how can we even think of solutions? And that's why smog tower is such a big joke. And imagine today, what is that amount we saw? 20 crore for one smog tower, whereas under National Clean Air Program, one city got about 10 to 20 lakh rupees for the clean air action plans, right? You are diverting and locking up your resources for inconsequential solutions, and which will never deliver. Now, that's the gimmick that we really have to protect.
It's a good headline. It looks nice on TV and it looks nice in the newspapers to say by, we are showing we're doing something and therefore let's have a smog tower. Jyoti ji, I think you wanted to come in to make a point on what Anvita ji was saying.
I am just so grateful for whenever any expert comes out and says it clearly out there that this is a joke, because it is a very expensive joke that we are all paying for out of our own tax money. And actually, in this matter, I think the courts as well as the politicians are equally to blame in some way, because I think the Supreme Court was, they had made this direction, and then of course the politicians were more than happy to pour money into it because it's not going out of anybody else's pockets. And so I just feel very strongly that when you are trying to reduce emissions is when you're really trying to make an impact. And this kind of gimmickry really, I mean, it's actually not a joke. It's a tragedy, because people, even if you go there, and I think we have had scientists who have tried to, demonstrate through writing papers that, you can't have outdoor air purification done. But I don't even understand why, when you have the IITs, it's such a complex issue, because you have scientists who have been reeled in to do things which they actually don't believe in. I don't know if if people are aware that when the Supreme Court came up with this, IIT Bombay actually had pulled out of this project. And then the Supreme Court said, well, you've got to come in, and they almost threatened contempt of court. So at a time like this, when science is not being used as the basis for things like this, I think that is when it becomes kind of a comedy and a tragedy of mammoth proportion. So that's all I really wanted to.
It's an important point, because then it shows that, like I said, ad hoc sort of solutions and things that are done for optics and headlines, and people need to know that's not the way it's going to work. I'm going to come back, though, Bhargav Krishna, to a question that people keep asking when we talk about tackling air pollution, which is, of course, how China did it, how Beijing did it. Now, we saw that, they sort of went into, zero emissions transport. They really clamped down on sources of pollution, etc. And they've really been unrelenting in that fight. And they've also shown that your economic growth doesn't have to be impacted by, switching to green or just being environmentally more conscious. What is it that India can realistically learn from the Beijing experience? Given the way our different sort of government function as well, but what is it that we can?
Sure. I think there's several things that can be learned, not just from the Chinese experience, but experiences from elsewhere around the world as well. I think every major city, every major country in the world has had an air pollution problem at one point or another, whether it be Mexico, the USA, the UK. All of them have air pollution problems at one point or another, and all of them have stuck to the science when it comes to decision making around how to address the issue of air pollution. The single easiest answer that you can get from any scientist when they ask you what can you do to reduce air pollution levels in any city is cut emissions at source. There is no other way you're going to reduce air pollution. And if you're trying to fool people into believing that sticking plaster solutions like sticking up a smoke tower in the center of the city is going to solve your air pollution problem, then you're deluding not just yourself but everybody else as well. It's a challenge because one, this is a solution that somehow the judiciary seems to have caught onto as something that is visible and will inspire people to do more on air pollution or something like that. But it's an easy get out of jail clause for the political class who would otherwise choose to take, who would otherwise be required to take much harder decisions when it comes to identifying and cutting source specific emissions. Now, what we learned from China is that once you have political will, actions will happen on the ground, and you have experience from around the world that can inform you exactly how you need to go about doing this. But what you need to team with that is a realistic strategy for how you're going to do it. What we know from what you and Anumita have said is that this is all of our policy making is now ad hoc and focused solely on the short term. Our long-term policy making is more sort of grand ideation and really doesn't have any sort of concrete targets or ambitious goals when it comes to achieving improvements in air quality. We need realistic long-term strategies that focus on reductions in ambient air pollution over the next 10 to 15 years. The NCAP has set a target of 20 to 30% reductions from a 2017 baseline. It's going to have marginal health benefits, if any at all. And really, if there's any lesson to be learned from the WHO's air quality guidelines, is that we need to be significantly more ambitious when it comes to long-term targets. Set a long-term target and say that realistically, we can only do this in 15, 20 years, but at least set a roadmap and say that these are the timelines that we will set, and this is what we will achieve by these periods of time. And these are the sectors on which we're going to be taking action.
You're saying that, you're saying realistically, really don't expect change for another 15, 20 years, but set those targets now. If you set realistic targets now, you can only achieve them then. Can I ask you for a suggestion on what you think is a realistic approach then to this?
So this is a regional problem. I think we keep coming back to this issue of at least air pollution in the north is a significant regional problem, and you're not going to solve it by focusing solely on Delhi. This needs to be a regional airshed management issue, and that requires bringing to the table stakeholders from all of these affected states and relevant stakeholders from industry who are contributing to some of these source emissions as well. And that is not something that's going to happen just by focusing on, say, Diwali air pollution in Delhi or stubble burning in Punjab, right? This is a year-round problem. It requires comprehensive policy thought that goes into designing solutions that address emissions across power, across transport, across all of these different sectors that need action across the board. So you can transition Delhi to BS6, or you can say that fireworks are banned in Delhi, but if people in Ghaziabad and in Noida and in Gurgaon are running BS4 cars and they're burning firecrackers in Diwali, you're still going to have the same air pollution around the general area. So this is not going to work if we focus on an approach that is highly restricted to one geographical region, which is the National Capital Region, and you have tons of money and tons of policy expertise that's going into a Commission on Air Quality Management that focus solely on NCR, right? You need to expand this and focus on all of the states that are being affected by this, not just this region.
Let me get quick last comments from all of you then. Anumita Roy Chaudhary, do you think that the PMO, which actually is the sort of fountainhead of all decision making in this country, that it really needs to step in and take charge of this, in a much bigger way? Because this is, as we keep saying, not about Delhi. This affects the economy. It affects even the investment climate in the country. Air pollution, I mean, it'll turn off investors if they want to look at it that way. It's killing people. Do you think that appealing directly to the Prime Minister and his office to take charge of this for the country, I mean, is that what do you think is needed at this point?
So what is very clear, and absolutely, if the top office in the country takes charge, of course, that's where the political support and the political momentum that we require for the solutions to take off, that will certainly happen. But what is more important is that, yes, we would certainly want the Prime Minister to step in and do something about this. It's important that whether it's under Prime Minister or whatever mechanism that we set up, the interministerial process has to first take stock of all the barriers that are stopping or delaying action in each sector. Today, we are talking about air quality solutions, but most of the solutions are linked with some structural issues that politicians are finding it extremely tough to move. Like, I'll just give you one example. That today, one of the biggest solutions that we are looking at is that the energy transition for everything, in industry, for cooking, for heating, for running our vehicles, it's electricity. Okay, that is the future that everyone is looking at. But clean electricity, that it should come from renewable energy. But either from renewable energy, and the Prime Minister himself has supported the 450 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2030. And we are still not close to meeting that target. Now, to be able to do that, all the structural problems that we have in the electricity sector today, that the DISCOMs are in red because of our pricing policy, they cannot recover the basic cost and therefore they cannot invest to improve their systems. Now, these require political decisions and political support. I mean, look at the irony of it. Industry will be happy to use clean fuel provided it's cheap. But the cleanest fuel, electricity, is very expensive. Even the cleaner fuel like natural gas is more expensive than coal because we tax natural gas higher than coal. Now, if these basic distortions are not taken care of, and that's where the political leadership is required to bring this kind of reforms. So clearly, therefore, we certainly need the political attention at the highest level to push these reforms. Intention is there. I'm not so pessimistic to say that nothing is happening. A lot of processes have already been put in place.
But it needs to be more proactive, and perhaps more
involved. And more
holistic,
with more system-oriented changes.
So last comment to you, Jyotiji, to those, especially in North India, who think that running away to Bangalore or Goa in the winter is going to be their solution to keeping themselves healthy. What would you say to them?
Well, actually, the latest research shows that pollution in the south, in Kerala, in Goa, and in Odisha is increasing at a faster rate than pollution in North India, because I think North India has reached some huge levels. But these areas, so there's no place to run actually. And, just to come back to something that you were asking and Anamita was saying, I frankly think that unless this push comes from the PMO, it's really not going to make a difference because it is such a complex issue. There are so many different, you can't take a decision. Air pollution is connected in so many ways. There's clean energy, there's clean mobility, everything is interconnected. So unless you don't have it from the top, it's not going to work. This is what happened with Swachh Bharat. Unless you don't have Swachh Hawa, you're not going to get Swachh Bharat in that sense. So it has to come from the top. It has to be accountable. It has to be transparent. And, these kind of stupid red herrings like smog towers really have to go, because honestly, if you just look at the number of filters they have 5,000 filters each, 2 smog towers, that's 10,000 filters. They're physical filters. They are going to have to be disposed of. We already have overflowing landfills, so they're going to get burned. So actually, these things are ending up increasing pollution. So honestly, there has to be a focus. It has to come from the top and with the grassroots support. So it has to be from all sides, and the corporates also have to. There are too many lobbies there that are, right from fireworks to automobiles. Everywhere there are lobbies. So that is why the push has to come from the PMO.
Absolutely. I think the fight against air pollution has also exposed, very obvious economic divisions in the country as well, where those who are well off and have air purifiers at home might be slightly better off, but that doesn't really solve the problem and doesn't mean they're not being affected by the air they breathe. So I think they're in some la-la land that because they've got the best air filters at home, that, they're all right and they can just, somehow get through these couple of months of winter. And obviously those who are the hardest hit are the poorer, and we need to find solutions for all of us. And therefore, thank you to all of you for giving some suggestions today on what possibly the policy roadmap needs to look like, particularly with these new guidelines. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.